So pretty, the Indian. Now, if y'all been following along, today I didn't do no questions, so we don't have a paper to pass out, and I've got one ending, pretty much the ending few verses in chapter 4 is all that. We've got one, I think, before that, but today we'll be in the book of Ruth. We're going to kind of cover chapter 3 briefly, and into chapter 4. But I want to kind of go back when we started here in the book of Ruth. We kind of started out with the first 5 verses in chapter 1. And we saw right off the bat that it was maybe a little different than you looked at the book of Ruth before. We went into it with a different perspective and a different view of things. And we saw how in the first 5 chapters that Elimelech fled. And he fled God's country. He fled Bethlehem, where God was present, where God had brought his people to. And he fled into a pagan land. He fled into Moab, and he took his wife and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. He took both of them into this country, and they fled because of the problems. He fled because of the famine that had happened in Bethlehem. There was a famine, so he fled, and that's what we looked at in the first time of this. We really just looked at those 5 verses and kind of reflected on how it relates to us and how we sometimes, when things get hard and things get tough, sometimes we want to flee. And sometimes we do that by staying away from fellow believers. Sometimes we do that by staying out of church. Sometimes we just want to isolate ourselves and just get in a dark place and lock ourselves up. And that's what people do. And I'm going to tell you, that's the wrong thing to do. And we talked about that, and we spoke of it, and we said sometimes, you just need to get up, go to the door, remember? Go to that window when it's really dark and look outside and look at the stars, because God's still there. And that's what he's put there to remind you that he's there with you. And so, but this is how we started Ruth. He ran to get away from his problems instead of just staying there and trusting God. And that's what we got to do. When things get dark, when times are tough, and we're going through these trials and tribulations, we got to stay our course. We got to trust God. And so they went into this pagan land with these false gods. Our God wasn't there. They didn't want him there. They worshiped false gods. They had false idols. And you know what? That right there is where they allowed their sons to marry, which was totally forbidden for God's people to marry into the Moab, culture, and the Moab women. But this is what Elimelech and Naomi allowed. Their sons married these Moabites. And then we saw where he died. Elimelech died, and both of his sons died in that land. And this is sad, because it left Naomi there. She was in a foreign land. And now she's got these 2 daughter-in-laws that are Moabites. And that's what we looked at the rest of that chapter the following week. Is we saw how we can be disobedient, how Naomi was being disobedient and trying to hide up her sin, trying to cover her disobedience, trying to cover her sin. And we also saw that God had lifted the famine. Now, after 10 years, they served 10 years in Moab. God lifted the famine in Bethlehem and Judah. So what happened? Naomi wanted to go back now. She's ready to go back to her country. And that's what we talked about last week. But she didn't want these pagan wives, daughter-in-laws of hers, to go back. And, I kind of just see that as, because then all the Christian people supposedly, they're going to see that they allowed their sons to marry these women. They allowed this when it's totally forbidden. And the Bible says to the 10th generation, they are not allowed. And when they do, it don't say that it's totally not going to happen, but it says when they do, that the children for the 10th generations out are not allowed to have have no inheritance or no nothing. That's scriptural. And so she kind of discouraged these women from following her. They wanted to go with her. Their husbands had died, and so they wanted to follow after her. And you know what? She didn't want them to return with her, to the point that she told them, it's better for you just to stay in your land. You know, stay with your families and worship. And we talked about Orpah. Orpah did after so long. You know, and some scholars claim that they traveled maybe half the way. It was a long way from Moab down around and back up to Bethlehem, a long journey. And some claim that they were journeying, and she's telling them to go back. They were continually following with her. But she finally convinced, and you know, and that's what we talked about. They said that maybe Orpah half-heartedly was going with her. Maybe Orpah really did want to go back to where she could marry, you know, because we went through the whole marriage thing that they was not allowed now. There's no other son for them to marry, which was the kinsman redeemer that's in Deuteronomy, that's in the law. If there's any kinsman left, then they was to be redeemed. They could marry these women. Well, she told them that that's not going to happen now. I've not got any more children. And anyway, Orpah went back, and we never heard about her again in the story. She's never talked about again in the Bible, as far as I know. But now Ruth, we said Ruth, that's a different story. Ruth continued to follow her, and really by rights, when Naomi told her to go, she was supposed to obey, but she didn't. She said, you know what, I want to go to your land. I want to go to your people and be your people. I want your God to be my God. And you know what? She didn't just say that. She meant it. That was heartfelt because God used her. And if it hadn't been, if it had just been, I want to go for the food, which is why Naomi was going back. She wasn't going back because God was there. She was going back because the famine was lifted. She was going back for alternative reasons, alternative motives. I'm going to go back now where I can eat and everything will be great in our land. But it wasn't because our God was there. So in chapter 2, then we got to the return. Naomi returned to Bethlehem. Well, you know what? She was bitter. She blamed God for everything that had happened to her. And she was even the women come to her and talked about, you know, her countenance and how she looked. And we talked about the stress probably that she had been under, the things that she had been through in her life in those 10 years. It took a toll on her. But the bottom line is she was bitter against God for all these things that had happened. She blamed God. You know, and we can relate to that. People, that's you know, I've said it a lot. When trials happen and tribulations is going to, and if they ain't, hold on, because they're coming. You know, you've got really two roads you can take when that happens, when that hits in your life. You either serve God and look to Him to get you through it, or you turn away from Him. And that's what Elimelech done here. People may not see that, people may not realize that, but that's what stuck out to me when we started in Ruth. Is when this famine hit, he all of a sudden up and got his family and they left. They went to a land that wasn't controlled by God. He went to a land that wasn't blessed by God. But they seen with their eyes, not with their heart. They seen what was around them, and that's how they acted. You know, and that's what we do a lot of times when we see these trials, we see these horrible things that's in our lives that's happened, and a lot of times we act by sight and not by faith, and that can get us in trouble. And but you know what? When you look at Ruth here, Naomi now she's back in Bethlehem. She's bitter. She's all against God. She's told all these women, I don't want. You know, I left here with everything. I come back empty-handed. I had nothing. You know, and it's all God. God is just upon me. You know, He is just against me, and you know, we talked about that this morning in Sunday school. But you know what, Ruth? It was a different story with Ruth. Ruth wasn't that way. Ruth was excited to serve Naomi and to be there. And so what did she do when they got there? Naomi just was in that dark place. She didn't want to do nothing. I can just picture her just sitting there moping and bitter, mad, and everything's against me, and don't nobody talk to me, don't nobody bother me. But you know what Ruth's doing? She got up every morning. She got up early every day, and she went to these fields to glean. Why did she do this? For one, they had to eat. And this was a provision, this was a part of the law that God had ordained, and Ruth knew this. Now, Ruth was not raised in this belief, but she knew. And this is her faith. This is her obedience. She knew that God had appointed this, that these fields, everything is not to be taken out of these fields. There's to be some things left. When they go through and harvest these fields, you leave some gleanings, and you leave a little bit of leftover, and you leave it for the widows and for the poor. That's why God done that. And Ruth got up every morning, and that's what she said. I'm going to glean the fields. She went for one to gather on food. Naomi, I'm thinking this wouldn't do nothing. She's bitter. She's done. I'm sick of it. But Ruth got up every day and worked all day in them fields gathering food for Naomi. And she served her. And she said, I'll go and hope that, God finds favor on me. She knew that these were left. This was an ordinance of God. And she knew by hard work and dedication, she had faith. She believed that God has left these for people. For me, I'm a widow and I'm poor. And God's going to bless me. And this isn't a time when she could have just laid down too. She could have just give up too. I mean, she's from a pagan land, brought up in a pagan culture. Who is this God that, she didn't know nothing about it. But you know what? She trusted the Lord to provide, because that's what it said in His Word. And He took care of her. And then she believed that. So it's her hard work and her trust and faith as she continued in these fields every day. Who showed up? The owner of the fields, which just so happened to be a very wealthy man, Boaz. While she was gleaning in the field, he took notice. Now, we think, well, that's just a coincidence, or we think she went to these fields on purpose. She didn't. We didn't discuss that. We went over. She didn't know who owned these fields. She didn't know for sure he wasn't going to be there because he's a wealthy man. I mean, how many times have you went to these factories to work every day and seen the owner of them factories there? It's just not going to happen. They don't, but you know what? This was all ordained. This was all God's provision. And so Boaz is there and he questions, who is this lady? Who does she belong to, Well, she's a Moabite. She's a widow. And so he went to kind of noticing this and told him to leave a little extra here, put a little extra. He even sat down at one point and eat with her and talked with her. And, he knew it was from Naomi. He knew Elimelech. Anyway, so that kind of gets us caught up to where it was at. Naomi, for one, tried to discourage them to go back. Ruth continued. Ruth had faith. She trusted God's going to provide and take care of them. And it just took hard work. And she worked every day. She didn't ask for nothing. She wasn't expecting nothing. She didn't go to this field because I'm going to manipulate this guy. I'm going to go and really pretend to do all this, and then maybe He'll bless me. That wasn't the motive behind it. She done it, I believe, from her heart, just like it says. And if it had been the motive, then I don't believe God would ever bless her, because He knew her heart. So we get to chapter 3 now, and it brings us up to some more. To me, what I've seen and took of this is still Ruth's, her trust, her obedience. As Naomi had told her, Naomi now, this is the one that's bitter, sad. This is the one that's supposed to know the Lord. She told her to go now, to go to these fields and seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee. And she knew, Ruth had been telling her about Boaz. I kind of left that out. But Naomi knew that this is a kinsman now. This Boaz, she's put it together. This is a kinsman from Elimelech. And also that would be passed down to Chilion and Mahlon, the boys, which is Naomi's sons that died. So she has told her, now you have found favor in this man, and so you need to go and seek him. You need to go. They was having a big party for the harvest, and so long story short, Naomi has told her this is time now for you to go present yourself to Boaz and to give him an opportunity to be your kinsman redeemer, which we kind of touched on a little bit last week. That's where if your brother dies, then you're to take just so that inheritance, that land, is passed on. And why this was an ordinance of God, and that's because these widows, these people that were poor, that had lost a husband, or they wasn't to be took advantage of by the wealthy, by the rich. That's why that's why it's a kinsman redeemer. If your brother died and he had a wife, then as his brother, you're supposed to take her and bear a child with her, so that his name is passed on, so that he can inherit that land. And that name will continue, that family line will continue. That was the purpose of this. So that she's poor, needs money, she won't just sell it, and then the wealthy just take advantage of these widows and poor. So this is why God had ordained this and set this in effect. And so this man was of the lineage of Elimelech. Anyway, to kind of set it up, so that's where we're at in chapter 3. So Ruth is to present herself, her claims to Boaz, and to give him an opportunity to be her kinsman redeemer. And that's what I was trying to set that up, so you kind of understand what that means and what it is. Now this kinsman, he had the opportunity to buy back her estate, which had been lost in poverty or whatever. That's in Leviticus, and that's kind of what I was talking about. That way the land stayed in the possession of the people. And the kinsman, of course, had to be willing to be able to redeem. So Ruth followed the custom of the day and presented her case to Boaz. Now imagine the faith. Imagine how she felt when Naomi said, "This is what you got to do, You need to go." And if he's to redeem her deceased husband, he had to marry Ruth to do it, the widow. So she goes and does what Naomi tells her. And Boaz, as they done the threshing, as they were in the harvest, it said the men often sleep at the threshing floor, and that's to protect their grain, their harvest, so that people don't come in and steal it. And it talks about here in verse 9, so people don't question it. And she said, "Spread your skirt over your handmaid," And that wasn't nothing negative. That wasn't nothing bad. But in that day, that was and really she is kind of proposing to the man, is what she's doing here. She's kind of pushing the issue, which was kind of not normally done either. But this is what Naomi had told her to do. You need to go do this and see where we're at here. See if we have a future, or if he's going to even take up his role as a kinsman redeemer. Anyway, so she says, "Spread your skirt over the handmaid." And that was her legal claim to Boaz. And what she was asking him is to be her redeemer, to claim her as his wife. It wasn't to sleep with her then. That's not what she's saying. She just asked him to cover her. And that would mean that I will take you in as my wife, and I will be your kinsman redeemer. And so that's what she's asking him. And it had to take some faith and courage for her. This is a wealthy man, and she's a young lady. He's an older guy. To even ask him this, but this is what Naomi told her, so she's still obeying the one that's give up on the Lord. And so it says Boaz rejoiced that this young woman didn't reject him because of his age. And he promised her to fulfill the duty of a kinsman the very next day. And he told her, "You stay right here, get up in the morning." And he sent her away with, what did it say, 6? It tells her he sent her away with plenty when she left. Now we got to chapter 4, that just kind of sets it up. She has went, and he has told her, there's another one. There's another man in Bethlehem that had a prior claim that's above Boaz. So he had to go to this man. So he meets him at the gate. He approached 10 men first. They needed witnesses. So he gathers these 10 men up as witnesses to this. And just so happened this man comes along. So he asks this man, he brings him in and says, "You have a claim to this Moabite. You have a claim to Elimelech's land, and we need to resolve this issue before some stranger comes in and buys this land that has been mortgaged or sold. You have, as a kinsman, you have an obligation, or you have the right to claim it if you want it." And of course, the guy wanted it. "You bet. I'll take it." But look what he said then, when he told him this Moabite goes with it. Now, Elimelech was gone, but by his son being the next heir, It was not Naomi that the man had to claim, but the son, because the son would have been the heir. So now it's Ruth. He said, you can get this land, but you will have to marry Ruth, and you will have to pass on. That man's name is the name. Well, that was it. That would be his inheritance. So the guy didn't want to do it. Because what about my sons now? They'll lose their inheritance if I join this and pass it on over here. My name will go under his name. My seed will be his redeemers. And I will lose mine. So he declined it, which is exactly what Boaz wanted, because Boaz loved Ruth, and he wanted to do it. So that set him up as the next in line. And you know what? If you think about this, we had a redeemer too. And you know, as Boaz stepped into the place, now he's a rich man, and he's give up all of his stuff right here to take Ruth. Now he's a man of the harvest. Boaz was. He was in the threshing floor where he harvested all. And I mean, for it to say he's a wealthy man, don't tell him how much he had, don't tell him how many fields. But how wonderful is it that Christ is willing to make us part of his inheritance and claim us as his bride. That's what the church is. That's what the believers here today are. We are the bride of Christ. Just like Ruth had went, laid down at the feet of Boaz. What have we done? You should get down on your knees when God's convicting you, and you're at the feet of the Lord, and you humble yourself. And you know what God does? He takes you in. He covers you with that blanket and says, you know what? I love you. You're mine. I'll redeem you. And that's just what Boaz did to Ruth. How unselfish was it for him to give up everything, just as our Lord did? He came from heaven and gave it up for us. Now Ruth he would carry on this name, not his name, but the name of her husband. That's where I was talking about this guy. This is why the guy didn't want to do it. He didn't want that name to be the name of her husband and his estate. So to him, it was a bad business deal. That's the way he looked at it. It's like, I'm not giving up my estate for that little piece of land. I've got my own kids. And so Boaz was willing to pay the price, redeem the woman and her estate, simply because he loved her. That's why he done it. There was no money in this. There was no gain in this. He's a wealthy man, had all the land he needed, all the money he needed. But he's willing to give all that up because he loved her just for that little piece of property that Elimelech left, or mortgaged. Now, what a wonderful picture I put is that of Christ and his love for the church. Because that's what he done. And now we're going to discover the whole significance of this book. Ruth becomes ancestress of who? Of David. Deuteronomy 23:3, it excludes, this is what I was talking about earlier, it excludes a Moabite from the congregation of Israel. It excludes them. Even to the 10th generation. But you know what? The grace of God overrides that, don't it? When Jesus came, it kind of changed that old law, didn't it? Thank the Lord. The grace of God made Ruth, the Moabitess, guess what? A member of an earthly family. A member of a family that gave Christ to the world. And we talked about this when we done Matthew. When we started out in Matthew, we looked at this. And Ruth was a Gentile. And so was Tamar. Remember Tamar? Bathsheba. That's even more proof of God's grace. They were Gentiles as well. This book begins, and I'm going to close, this book begins with a funeral. It begins with them disobeying, running away from their problems. And they died. Elimelech and both his sons, they run to this country. But you know what it ends with? A wedding. It ends with a bride. It ends with a mom. It opens with famine and it closes with fullness. Ruth's love for her mother-in-law and her willingness to obey the word brought her into joy and blessing. You see that? The willingness to obey. It was her choice. She could have turned like Oprah and went right on back to her pagan lands and married. They knew they could go back there and marry. It wasn't nothing there. It didn't mean nothing. They could go back there and do whatever they wanted. But she didn't. And Naomi telling her, when you get over here, you're never going to have a husband. You're going to be alone. You know, God's against us. His hand's upon us. But she didn't. She continued on, and she trusted and believed. The decision that she made in chapter 1, it determined her future. You know what? The things that we do today, the things that our mothers do, you moms do, may determine the future. If the man ain't willing to step up, the mom has to. And the things that, look at Ruth. She had no husband. Had she gone back to her heathen way of life and back to that culture, we probably wouldn't have heard more about her either. She definitely wouldn't be talked about today. Well, she might have. We talked about Orpah. But it wouldn't be in a positive way. Now, I want you to look back on this. Chapter 1 shows Israel out of the will of God and suffered his chastening. We talked about that this morning. But then God begins to deal with the Gentile, Ruth. Just as today, he's calling out from the Gentiles a people for his name. That's us. And that's in Acts 15:14. It says that very thing. Now, Naomi's blessing came after Ruth's wedding. Just as Israel will be restored and blessed after Christ and his church are united. Amen. Now, certainly Boaz here, now this is what some of the scholars say. Boaz could certainly be considered a picture of Christ in this Old Testament book. And Ruth, as our kinsman redeemer. That's what Boaz is known as here. And that's what Christ is. Christ took upon himself flesh without sin, that he might redeem us. That's the whole purpose of it. He paid the price, and he did it because he loved us. He didn't have to redeem us. He didn't need the land, just like Boaz. He didn't have to take in this Moabite. He loved her. And Boaz, he was the Lord of the harvest then. He was the man in the fields. He owned them, just like Jesus is the Lord of the harvest. He supplies our needs. He redeems the inheritance for us, and he gives us rest. Now, disobedience here, it's a serious matter. It costs Naomi her husband and her sons. So no matter how difficult, folks, the circumstances get, or they may be at the time, the only place for God's people is in the will of God. That's it. There shouldn't be a question. There should never be, a want to turn away from him or to blame him. All we need to do is consider his will and what he has for us to learn out of this situation. When we seek satisfaction from the world, I guarantee you, you're going to pay a high price for it. And you ain't never going to be satisfied. So, however, you know what? The good thing about our Lord is he's willing to forgive and restore. He won't just forgive my mistakes, but he'll restore me if I'll let him. If I'll just confess and tell him, you know what? I make mistakes every day. I need you to help me. Man, he'll pick you right back up. But you know what? We can't never get back. Just what Naomi lost is that time. We can't never get back that time that we've got out of this straight and narrow and we've hit them dirt roads and been out there in the dark. We can't get that time back that we spend out of God's will. But we can get back into fellowship with him and regain that joy and that testimony. Because when you're out there, you're going to have a testimony because you go to thinking you can do it on your own and you can fix it. And sometimes God has to just drive you to your knees to show you that without me, you're nothing. And that's the way I am. Sometimes I have to be reminded of who I serve and the power that he has. Now I want to close with this last little bit here, 13 through 22. In the book of Ruth, chapter 4. And I want y'all to listen to this, and I want you to get this. And think about everything we've talked about in this book and where it's leading to here. How it started and where it ends. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. He went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. Now this is the Lord. The Lord allowed her to have a son. You know, we never thought about this before. She was married, had a husband, but there's never no talk of children. Now, if she'd had a kid with him, then he would have been the Redeemer. This is God's plan from day one. That Ruth has come into her life. And the Lord knew what Ruth was. He knew how she was going to be. Orpah could have had a kid. He would have been the new Redeemer of the land. She didn't have one either. So this is God's plan. He's put Boaz in her life. they've had a kid. It says the Lord gave her conception, folks. You know what? When you get pregnant with a child, it's the Lord that allowed that. That child is a blessing of God. She bare a son. And the women said unto Naomi. Now these are the women when she came in, talked to her and greeted her, and she was pretty hateful to. It says, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And why would they say that? These are the women of the town. And this is Bethlehem, of all places, the very Bethlehem that Jesus is going to be born in. This is a pretty significant place. And he shall be under thee a restorer of thy life, and a nurturer of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. Now that's a big deal in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel, I believe. I know in Job chapter 1, I think verse 2, they talk about 7 sons. 7 sons was a big deal to the men. It's a big deal in the Bible. 7 for one, and then the sons. These women had said, and that's a major thing here to point out. I didn't really go into it because Dorothy will start flashing stuff at me. Which is better to thee, but they told her, this daughter-in-law, now this is a Moabite, a pagan, is better to thee than 7 sons. And Naomi took the child, laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. And one of the commentaries said, pretty much in today's age, that would mean adopted it. This is her son, just like it's Ruth's. This is now, I'm your grandma, even though that was just her daughter-in-law. And the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, This is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. And look here. Obed. He is the father of who? Of Jesse. Who's the father of David? Jesse. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. Now let's get into it. Let's see the whole plan. We looked last week, we said God's plan unfolding. Here's the plan unfolded. This is the plan. This is the redeemed. This is what the whole plan was from the beginning. When they disobeyed, God restored. These are the generations of Pharez. You know who that was? That was the son of Judah through Tamar's deception when she pretended to be a harlot and led Judah in. Pharez, this is the one. He begot Hezron. And Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. And Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot who? Boaz. And I believe it's Matthew, it says Boaz. B-O-O-Z is the same man when you look it up. It's Boaz. And who did Boaz begot? Obed. You know what Obed means? Worshipper. You know what Obed means in Hebrew? Servant of God. And Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. The King David. Right on down to Jesus. You know what? Ruth, through her obedience. Now this is Ruth, a Gentile. This Tamar was a Gentile. This wife of David on down here, Bathsheba, was a Gentile, I'm pretty sure. Ruth, through her obedience, folks, her faith, she was redeemed. God redeemed her at last. And this wasn't a big plan. She wasn't deceiving nobody. She wasn't trying to deceive and to get this. This was because her heart was pure. She believed and she trusted and she worked. She didn't do this out of spite. She didn't do this for her gain. But you know what? She wasn't only blessed by a kinsman redeemer as a husband that would look after her, take care of her, but God blessed her as a mother. God blessed her as a mother. He gave her a son, 4:13, we just read it, that would become the grandpa to King David. And you know what else he added to her? He added her to the genealogy of the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus Christ. That's what happens when you obey God. That's what happens when a mother is obedient to the Lord. Her son went all the way down to King David, all the way down to Jesus. And Orpah is not mentioned anywhere else. You know why? Because she turned back. She probably had a little bit in her heart that she wanted to go back and marry and get a husband and live in their family. And instead of taking a chance with this God and this pagan. But this is it, folks. This is a mom that laid right down to Jesus. And why? How? Because of obedience. It all started with obedience and hard work. She went to those fields every day to feed Naomi, to take care of her, to look after her. Why? Because she knew the Word of God said that they were left for the widows and for the poor, and she could do that. They had to let her do that. She didn't know whose fields they was, and you know what? God led them there. Led her there, led him there, and it led right up to this. So my thought for the day is, no matter where you're at, no matter how it looks in your house, in your life, obey God, trusting and believing Him. Because as a mother, you never know where that lineage is going to lead to. You never know how God's going to use that to benefit generations to come. As the music plays, you feel God spoke to you. If you feel that it's time to move, God's calling you to do something, come on. We'll talk about it. Come on, pray. Maybe God's just telling you to pray. Maybe you just need to pray. You know what? Maybe you can pray right there where you're at. Sometimes it's good just to humble yourself, just get on your face before the Lord and tell Him, I'm sorry, I messed up. Or maybe you just need to pray. Get it off your chest. Whatever it is, if God's dealing with you, get it right today. Don't wait. You may not get another chance.
Extra mile to prove your love was true, and you held out your hand as they drove the nails in you when you could have walked away. Took you back to all my sin, and for me you gave your life. You chose to be my friend.
Thank y'all for coming out. Just a few minutes over, so. All right. Y'all have a happy Mother's Day. Thank y'all for coming out to Buffalo River. Spend your morning. I hope y'all have a blessed day. And don't forget, come back, bring somebody back next week, and we'll get your nails done. We'll have a dinner. We'll eat.
We'll take pictures.
You gonna do pictures?
Next week. Like,
All right. Next week
maybe
we'll have
today too,
pictures.
but since we're staying after anyway.
All right. Sounds good. All right, Brother David, you want to close us out? We'll let these moms go.
Lord, thank you for this day and your blessing. Lord, we thank you for little Shane, Randy, all of the Lord that you mentioned on the way. Thank
Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you.